Greetings, class. Today we will begin chapter 7, which is the skeleton or the skeletal system. So this chapter is very involved, right? There are so many little pieces and parts to get down and memorize. I suggest, of course, as always, going through the lecture video, but like I said, it is not going to be comprehensive. And it does involve a lot of studying outside of our classroom. So, because of course we are virtual, I suggest going to PowerPoint, getting a little skeleton. So I know typically they're a little bit cheaper during the winter time or fall time around Halloween, or just getting kind of a little cheap one you can find maybe at the dollar store. And even though it may not be perfectly anatomically correct, it could still go a long way in helping with your studies. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The human skeleton, the average adult human has 206 bones. Do not worry, you will not be required to know every single one, but there are quite a few. All right, so the skeleton is divided into two parts. So we have the axial skeleton, and this is what you will see here in green. So this is the skull. So I know it's kind of small right here. Here's our skull. It would be our vertebrae. Okay, so the bones that surround our spinal column right here in the middle, our vertebral column. And then, of course, we have our thoracic cage. Remember, anything that is thoracic pertains to the chest, right? So the thoracic cage, same thing as what we typically think of as our rib cage. So these all have very important protective functions right here for the middle. So of course, the skull is going to protect the brain. The vertebral column is going to protect our spine, and the thoracic cage is going to protect those really important organs that we have in our chest cavity, such as our heart and lungs. So that is the axial skeleton. All right, the appendicular skeleton. This is the rest of the skeleton. So appendicular. All right, so if it's kind of hard for you to remember appendicular, think of appendages, right? So appendages are like our arms and legs, so our limbs, right? And axial, maybe think of things rotating on an axis. So the axial is in the middle, and the appendicular are on the sides, and we'll go through the different parts of that. So you see we have our arms, our legs, but we also have with the appendicular skeleton something called girdles. So we have our pectoral girdle. So about right here, this is what attaches our arms to our bodies. And then we have our pelvic girdle right here. And this is what's going to attach our legs to our bodies. So another look at the posterior view. You have your skull, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, and then of course our sacrum and coccyx that we'll talk about a little bit later in this chapter. But this here you see better on this posterior view, you can actually see the scapulae. So the scapulae, these are going to be what we think of as, you might think of them as like your back or shoulder bone. But kind of hunch your shoulders up a little bit and kind of poke them forward and reach back there. You can kind of see little pointy ends of your scapulae. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the skull. This can be considered a little bit more detailed than the other parts of the body just because there are so many different features that we need to get down. So the skull, as we said before, it houses the brain, right? It helps to protect and cushion our brain. So here are the bones of the skull. These are going to be separate from the bones of the face. All right. So you see here, the skull has little tiny sutures, right? It looks like it's been sewn up. These actually have spaces between our different skull bones when we are born and up to a certain age before they are fully formed or fused. So let's look at the superior view of the cranial fossa. So imagine that we have our skull, and I know it's kind of hard to picture if we don't have really a rotating picture, but we've taken the top. So let's say this person's looking straight ahead. So this is the anterior view. This is posterior. And we've done kind of a cross section, let's say divided right above the eyes and taken off the top of the skull. So we have 3 divisions, and this is really helpful when you're going through and studying these different divisions. Make it easier. Like, okay, let me just go ahead and start here. I'll cover up the rest of the skull and just memorize the important parts or anatomical parts of the anterior cranial fossa. All right, so we got that down. Then we can go ahead and move down to the middle cranial fossa and memorize the different foramen and different structures here. And then lastly, after we have that middle cranial fossa down, we can then move posteriorly to the posterior cranial fossa and look at the different structures and different characteristics of what is in here, okay? So anterior, middle, and posterior. So a fossa, this word right here, think of more of a groove, right? So a little groove, and these are different parts that actually fit the brain. All right, let's take a lateral view of the skull. So the parts of the skull that we name, they correspond to the parts of the brain. So right here, if you see our little arrows right here, we have the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. We have the frontal lobe of the cerebrum in the front, right? And then posteriorly, we have the cerebellum part of the brain, okay? So it helps with our balance, our orientation in space, and skilled muscle movements. So look, the little grooves that actually fit. So the frontal lobe is actually fitting into the anterior cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa houses or kind of attaches to the temporal lobe, and then that posterior cranial fossa houses the cerebellum. All right, so looking maybe just in front to make it a little bit easier, the little parts of the brain to kind of get down the different sections of the skull and the face. So these are our major cavities. So cavities are holes, and typically they're filled with different things. I don't want to focus too much on that. All right, so now let's get down to the names of the bones. So the cranium, or the skull, is comprised of 8 cranial bones. So 2 of these are actually paired, all right? So there is 1 frontal bone. So think of your forehead, right? So right in the front, this one is the easiest one, okay? There are 2 parietal bones. So 1 on the left, 1 on the right. There's 1 occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, 1 on the left, 1 on the right. There is a sphenoid and an ethmoid. So let's take a look at what they would actually look like on the skull. All right, and I'll show you a lateral view as well, because this is not showing us everything. So this big orangish kind of yellowish portion, this is the frontal bone. The frontal bone, this is the forehead, this is the front of the head. Okay, so forehead. All right, and then let me take you through a couple more, and then we'll look at a lateral view. All right, so the parietal bones, so this is going to be the right side of the person. This is the left-hand side of the person. So whenever you're looking at a patient, it's always going to be opposite. So if you want to cross your hands right now and point out right and left, that's very helpful for kind of getting down which bone we're looking at. And it's very important to always, when you're in class, if you're taking tests, when you get out there and start working, always to differentiate. Is it right or is it left when you are naming bones that are paired? So we have our right parietal bone and we have our left parietal bone right here in pink. All right, and let me show you a lateral view. Okay, so here we go again. So here's our frontal bone right here in the front. Here is our parietal bone. So the paired bones that are kind of toward the topmost and kind of to the back of this right here. So kind of our pinkish bone, all right? Then we have our temporal bone. Okay, so right here in orange, those temporal on the lateral sides. The occipital here pictured in brown. This is to the back or the posterior of the skull. And it's kind of hard to see the ethmoid and sphenoid, but if we're kind of just looking here with the skull fully intact, the ethmoid, and let me go right here, the ethmoid bone, this little piece of bone you can see right here in that orbit. And then we also have the sphenoid bone, and you can see a piece of it here right adjacent to the temporal bone. And let's go back to that anterior view and see if we can actually find the ethmoid and sphenoid. All right, here, it might be a little bit easier to see, you know, until we actually take kind of the top of the skull off. So here again, we can see those greater wings of sphenoid, a little bit right here, and then these hot pink parts or portions right here in the orbit. You can also see the ethmoid bone, which is going to be more of this kind of orangish portion right here in the orbit. So the way that I like to remember the different names of the cranium, the mnemonic is FPOT. Okay, so just for the major ones, we have frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. So FPOT, and those are going to be the major bones of the cranium besides the ethmoid and sphenoid bone. All right, so we looked at the anterior portion of the skull, we looked at the lateral view, and now we're going to take another look at that base of the cranial cavity. But this time we're going to have it color-coded for that anterior cranial fossa, the medial cranial fossa, and the posterior. So when we take the top off, so if we look here, look at the view, right? So taking, kind of slicing right above the eyes and taking maybe just the skull cap off and looking down into the skull or that cranial cavity. So if we look at just the yellow portion, which is going to be that anterior cranial fossa, let's go ahead and point out what could be most important for us to look at, okay? All right, so this is anterior, right? And this is posterior. So it's always good to get oriented with whatever bone you're looking at, right? So is it the front? Is it the back? Is it right? Is it left? Do I need to turn it over just to make sure that I'm facing in the right direction to avoid any kind of confusion? So the important things, we have the ethmoid bone. Okay, so right here. And the important parts of the ethmoid bone to look out for are the cribriform plate, right here, and then the crista galli. So this little line, it's a raised line right down the middle of that cribriform plate, and the little holes in there are cribriform foramina. So anything that's a foramen or foramina plural, those are holes. So the most important thing, we have the ethmoid bone, which consists of the cribriform plate, which is all this brown right here, and then the little line that goes right down the middle. This is going to be the crista galli, all right? So pretty much just three major things to know about that anterior cranial fossa, all right? So not too bad. So if you want to print off something like this that's not labeled at all and just practice labeling, or if you like to draw things out, that could also make it a little bit easier. All right, so now let's go to the middle cranial fossa. So with this one, it does involve a few more structures that we need to pay attention to. So this pink structure, now we can finally see most of the structure of the sphenoid, right? So we have the lesser wing of sphenoid, so right here on the top, and then we have the greater wing of sphenoid that we could actually see on that outer portion of the skull, which are going to be these larger portions in here, okay? There is a little groove right here, kind of in the middle portion of the sphenoid. This is the hypophyseal fossa, and this is where our pituitary gland hangs. So you can also call it the pituitary gland, the hypophysis. A fossa, remember, that's kind of a little groove. So this is the little groove where our pituitary gland hangs. It's kind of right between the eyes, but more posteriorly. So this is also known as the sella turcica. So this little groove right here, the sella turcica, in the hypophyseal fossa. All right, so now let's go and look at the little foramina or foramens or holes, if you will, of this middle cranial fossa. So the most anterior holes, we have two paired right here. These are the optic canal. So this is where your optic nerves enter and exit through the eye, so carrying information. All right, so next we're going to point out just 1, 2, 3, 4 foramina. All right, so the first one that's most medial, okay, this is the foramen rotundum. The next foramina is the foramen ovale. We have the foramen spinosum, which is the most lateral, and then the foramen lacerum, which is going to be more medial again. So if you're going to and trying to memorize these, we have rotundum, ovale, spinosum, lacerum. And it's always a good idea if you're going to go through all these very detailed things to come up with ways to actually remember these. You can make up a story, maybe a mind map, if you guys have heard of those before, to kind of get these together. So whenever I think of these middle foramina, I like to think of a round oval. Yes, I know an oval is not really round, but I think of that for rotundum, right? A round oval, so rotundum ovale. Then I have spinosum, maybe like spinning. So I draw my little spinning arrows. A round oval spinning on a lake, and I put lake for lacerum. So whatever way you can remember it. This is how I remember mine. So a round oval, rotundum ovale, spinning, spinosum on a lake, lacerum. All right. So those are the major portions of the things you'll find here in the middle cranial fossa. So you have portions, of course, of the sphenoid and a little bit of that temporal bone. All right, so last portion we have is that posterior cranial fossa. The major bone is the occipital bone, and you do have some parietal right here on the edges. All right, and this very large hole, the one that stands out the most, this is the foramen magnum. All right, and then you also have those jugular foramina right here on the edges. All right, so here is a non-color-coded skull. All right, so now let's go through our sutures. I just don't want to make it too long for you guys. Let's go ahead and go through our sutures. So our two parietal bones, remember those on the bones on the topmost part of the skull. These are separated the most by different 4 sutures that we have, okay? So first of all, we have the coronal suture. Oops. This is between the parietal bones and the frontal bone. So let me go ahead and show you all a picture. Okay. So this suture right here that we see, this is the coronal suture. Remember this is the frontal bone. And then this would be the right parietal bone, right? So this is the suture that's going to divide that right and left side from each other. I'm trying to see if I have a better depiction of this, but it's kind of hard to see with the different pictures that I have here. Here we go. Here's another one, all right? So that's another suture. All right, next up we have the sagittal sutures. This one is going to go right down the middle of the skull, and it's going to divide the left and right parietal bones. So think of sagittal or mid-sagittal, right? Remember that kind of division, that plane we learned? So think of something going right down the middle of the body. This is going to go right down the middle of the skull. And yeah. All right, then next up we have the lambdoid suture. This one is going to separate the parietal bones and the occipital bone. Let's take a look back here. Okay, so this is going to be our lambdoid suture, dividing the parietal from the occipital. And then here's a pretty good picture of that sagittal suture that is dividing those left and right parietal bones from each other. All right, last type of suture is the squamous suture. This is between the parietal and temporal bones on each side of the skull. So this suture right here, that's dividing the parietal from the temporal. This is the squamous, or remember, flat suture, all right? So a mnemonic to learn the sutures are come learn sutures, come learn. I always put some sutures. A lot of people leave squamous out for some reason, but come learn some sutures. So coronal, lambdoid, sagittal, and squamous. All right, so just some more depictions, some lateral depictions. We're gonna skip through this. All right, so now here is the inferior aspect of the skull. All right, so this is the inferior aspect, taking the skull, flipping it upside down, and removing the jawbone, which is the mandible, and we'll go over the face bones in a moment. All right, So flipping it over, taking a look, the only things that are really important, because I know there's so many different structures to look at, there are a few things that I do want to point out. So here we go. This is the anterior aspect of the skull, and this is posterior. All right. So we took off the mandible. So we have some more fossas and foramina. Remember, foramina is a hole. A fossa is more of a groove. So we have our incisive fossa. Remember, these are incisors, right? Right in the front of our mouths. And then a fossa is that groove. Okay. And then we have the palate, the hard palate, which some of it is in the maxilla, which is the upper part of our jaw, what we think of as our jaw, right? And then our palatine. Okay, so just some different things to point out. Here is our foramen magnum again, our jugular foramina. Okay, just some little things to point out. So let me go back over to the face bones. And I know we're kind of spending a lot of time on this, but there's so many different details that I do want you all to be familiar with. Let me go ahead and erase these. All right, so that's the easiest way to do it, right? Just to break it down, maybe just go over the cranium. So go over your F-pot and then take it down to do the different parts of the skull. So what I always recommend is, just like we divided the cranial fossas into middle, anterior, posterior, maybe divide your skull into 3 parts as well, going through like this. Here's one part, here's the middle part, and then here's my last part. And just going through, maybe covering up the screen and going through and memorizing each part of that. All right, let me go ahead and erase these. Let's go over our bones of the face. It's not too bad either. If you want to print out a blank skull like this and then practice going in and labeling the different parts. All right, so we know what our frontal is. Of course, that's part of the cranium. But now let's go down to the face. So if you see right here, we have these blue bones, or bluish kind of teal bones. These are our zygomatic bones. All right, so you see these are also paired. So most of the bones of the face are also paired. Okay, so our zygomatic, these are our cheekbones. Then you think of your cheeks. If you want to smile real quick in the mirror and kind of pinch your cheeks, these are going to be your zygomatic bones. All right. All right, so right here in the middle, we have the nasal bones. And let me see, here we go. So nasal bone. All right, this is also a paired structure. All right, there's a larger purple bone that we have right here. This is our maxilla. This holds our top teeth. Okay, so maxilla, M-A-X-I-L-L-A. It holds our front teeth. Let me see these right here. All right, and then the other major bone that we have right here is the mandible. So this will be considered our jawbone. Okay, and these are going to hold our bottom teeth. All right, so some other structures to look out for. We have a vomer, V-O-M-E-R, right here in the middle of the nose. All right. You can kind of see, like we did before, a little bit of the ethmoid bone. We have the lacrimal bone, and this is where our lacrimal glands are located. Here's how you spell lacrimal right here. And those glands help us to cry, like when we're having to study too hard. All right, so our lacrimal, and these are part of the orbit. So those are some of the major bones that we have of the face. So not too bad, right? So now let's take it a little bit further, a little bit more detailed. All right, so you see we have 2 little foramina, one over each eye or each orbit. This is called the supraorbital foramen. Okay, so that's singular, supraorbital foramen. So this supraorbital foramen is a little hole, and this is where the blood vessels and nerves are able to enter in and go down and up or sideways on the face, okay, to provide oxygen and nutrients. So supra means above, right? So think of Superman, he flies above the ground. So because we have supraorbital foramina, we also have infraorbital foramina. And here's that word right here, infraorbital. So think of infra being inferior, being below something, right? So below the eye. So infra, below, orbital, the orbit is the portion of bone, all these different bones combined that actually house the eyes. And then it's a foramen, which is a hole. All right, so not too bad. We have mental foramen as well. Okay. All right, so not too bad. Like I said, just go ahead and print that out and then practice labeling it. All right, here is a picture of the temporal bone, kind of popped out the skull so we can take a look at it. Here's a picture of the sphenoid. We kind of saw that picture in that cranial fossa. Here's our ethmoid bone, a better view of that taken out of the skull. All right, so we talked about our facial bones, right? So the cranium is made up of 8 bones, and the facial bones are made up of 14 bones, 12 of which are paired. The only ones that are single are going to be the mandible. Remember, that's your jawbone. And then your vomer, which is that little tiny bone, kind of posterior and inferior to the nasal bones. All right, mandible single. So maxillary, remember those, that's the bone that holds your top teeth and it's fused. So one on each side. We have those zygomatic bones that are our cheekbones. We have those paired nasal bones, the paired lacrimal bones. So for our tears, for our crying, our palatine bones. That was the bone that I showed you when I flipped the skull over. And let me go back and show you again. So our paired palatine, you can tell, right? It has a little suture right here in the middle. Our paired palatine, the single vomer, and then the inferior nasal conchae. And let me go back here to our frontal view, and we'll take a look at those inferior nasal conchae. Kind of hard to see on here, but let's see if I have it named on here for you guys. Even if it's not, here we go. So these little green tiny portions toward the inferior aspect of the nose, these are going to be inferior nasal concha. All right, let's take a look at our mandible. So, like I said, this is considered our jawbone. We do have a few different telling features of the mandible. There's so many different names that kind of go into it. I did touch on that mental foramen. And this is where you get those blood vessels and nerves coming into and going out of the face. So we have different parts of the mandible that articulate with the bones of the skull. So we have a condylar process, and a process is something that sticks out. We have the ramus of the mandible, just kind of the edge right here. We have the mandibular angle. We have the body. Let's see. And then we have a coronoid process more anteriorly. Okay, so condylar process is more posterior and the coronoid process is more anterior. So just kind of a closer up view of the mandible. I probably won't label too many of these, maybe the mental foramen, kind of knowing that, and then the condylar and coronoid processes. All right, some bones of the nasal cavity, and kind of skip through that. All right, so something important that does pop up in your homework is the hyoid bone. This is a bone in the anterior aspect of the neck that is inferior to the mandible. It's the only bone in the body that does not articulate directly with another bone. So this is a very testable answer. A very testable question. The only bone that does not articulate with any other bone, it's anchored to the body by ligaments. So if we look here, this is going to be the hyoid bone. Okay, so we talked about the bones of the orbit a little bit. Let's take a closer view of what they actually are composed of. So we talked about that supraorbital notch or foramen, same thing. And I know it can get confusing because there are many different names for the different words that we're looking at. Here is the infraorbital foramen. All right, a closer up view of our optic canal where our optic nerve enters. All right, so let's look here. So this is going to be the right side of the patient. Here's the left, okay? So if this is the outermost portion, this is going to be lateral. Right is going to be lateral or the side, and the left is going to be medial or in the middle. Okay, so our medial wall. And this is the lateral wall. Okay, so the bone that's making up the lateral portion of the orbit, this right here, this is our zygomatic bone. Now it's in blue. This kind of purplish, kind of grayish color, this is going to be part of our maxilla. This blue part right here, of course, that's part of our nasal bone, not really part of it. And of course, this larger kind of yellowish part right here, this is the frontal bone. So the bones that form the orbit could also be a very testable question. We have the frontal bone, the zygomatic, the maxilla, all right? So kind of forming the outer portion. But then more posteriorly, we have the wing, the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay. We have our ethmoid bone, kind of right here. And then we also have that lacrimal bone right here, this green portion, okay? So looking at different bones of the orbit and just know what is involved and what is not involved. All right, so let's go ahead on to our paranasal sinuses. These are kind of like little pockets in our face. So think of if you ever have a nasal infection or a cold, how your face actually can feel kind of painful and actually swollen to the touch and kind of burning sometimes in these different areas. So these little sinuses, when we are sick with a more topical, I'll say maybe people call a head cold, right? You have a bunch of infected mucus sitting in these sinuses that are making it swell and hurt. And that's kind of where you get that pain from that cold. All right, so we have frontal sinuses, of course, with our frontal bone. You have the ethmoidal air cells. So the theory behind ethmoidal air cells are that these cells are filled with air and they help to keep our skull light so our head isn't, is not constantly kind of dropping over. It's kind of like having a balloon, right, that we blow with air that floats. This is kind of that same concept. We also have our sphenoidal sinus. And then lastly, we have the maxillary. So these sinuses are named for the bones that they are associated with. And here's that lateral view. All right, so let me go ahead and go through the spine, and then we'll cut this off at the axial skeleton and move on to the appendicular for our next lesson. So for the spine, it's divided into 5 main regions. So we have the cervical spine. This is the neck. And it consists of 7 vertebrae, right? Next up, we have thoracic, and these are going to be 12 vertebrae. So think of your ribs. They are attached to the ribs. And then we have the lumbar, which are 5 vertebrae, and these are the lower back. Okay, and then towards the very base of the spine, we have 2 fused bones. We have a sacrum, which is as many bones fused together. Of course, they fuse over time as we get older. And then the coccyx, which is also a fused bone. Okay, so a kind of a good way to remember the number of different vertebrae for each section. Remember the meal time. So cervical, we have 7 vertebrae. Maybe think of eating breakfast at 7 a.m. For thoracic, we have 12 vertebrae. Think of eating lunch at 12 noon. And then for lumbar, we have 5 vertebrae. Think of eating dinner around 5 p.m. Now let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so this is the anterior view right here of the vertebral column. And here is a lateral view of the vertebral column. And you see how there are different curvatures of the spine. Okay, so we have the cervical curvature. This is the neck portion. This is going to be a concave curvature. The thoracic curvature is convex, and we put convex right here. Convex, while we have concave. And then the lumbar vertebrae, which are going to be the lower back, the part of the back as you get older that starts hurting more. This is going to also be a concave, okay, with the sacral then being convex. All right, so just kind of going and taking turns one after the other. All right, let's take a little closer look. Here are the ligaments and fibrocartilage. So many holding the neck and the different vertebrae together. I'm kind of skip through some of this because I am taking too long. All right, so let's talk about our intervertebral discs. So these are the little parts in between each vertebrae that help to cushion the spine, to help provide motility and movement and flexibility. So think of sitting up straight, leaning over, how the spine is moving, right? These intervertebral discs are helping with that movement and causing, if you don't have any pain, helping to kind of cushion and reduce pain if there is any. So important to know, there are two different parts of each intervertebral disc. There is the middle portion. This is called the nucleus pulposus. So it's kind of more jelly-like, more squishy on the inside. It helps with compression. So think of standing up straight. Those intervertebral discs are more kind of compressed down, right? So helps with elasticity, gives us that movement. The annulus fibrosus is kind of like the little portion on the outside. So let's say I have my little nucleus right here. And then I have my annulus fibrosus. It has a bunch of rings in it. Okay, so the major type of cartilage found here is fibrocartilage. If you remember, fibrocartilage is the type of cartilage that's found in high weight bearing or high stress areas, right? So we have to have a lot of weight kind of borne on our back, and that's why it kind of hurts so much as we get older. That fibrocartilage, it's compressed a lot, right? Having to stand up straight, stand up erect, holding up our knees, things like that. So this is the major type of cartilage that you'll find here in that intervertebral, in those intervertebral or IV discs. All right, so this is important because let's say there's some kind of injury. So here, this mini ring kind of outer layer, this is our annulus fibrosus. And this middle kind of jelly portion, this is the nucleus pulposus. And why this is important, if there's a spinal cord injury where we have a herniated disc, so this means there was a lot of pressure, something happened, maybe a car accident, maybe someone that plays tackle football, they were hit right in the spine. So what happens, this nucleus pulposus starts to bulge out of the annulus fibrosus right here, and it actually compresses this spinal nerve, and that's what causes all this pain. All right, so there are tons of questions too. What is bulging out or what is compressing the actual nerve? And that's going to be the nucleus pulposus bulging out of the annulus fibrosus, which is made out of that fibrocartilage. Let's take a look at an IV structure, at a at another structure. All right, so here's an image. You can kind of see here. So this kind of lighter part right here, this is the actual spinal cord. And then you can actually see the vertebrae, which are the bones, and then the intervertebral disc spaced between those bones, all right? So this is showing an intact nucleus pulposus. But right here, you see how this is actually, the nucleus pulposus actually bulging out to compress the spinal column. So it can have numbness, tingling, pain, all those different kinds of things that can happen with the herniated discs. So of course, painkillers, sometimes surgical, but it's always a big deal to have back surgery because there's so much room for error, or because you can actually lose sensation to many parts of the body. All right, let's go through a few different formations of the spine. All right, so we have different abnormal spinal curvatures. Remember, we talked about some that are normal, so for, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. But now we have a few different that are due to a few different things that happen in the body. So we have scoliosis. So let me show you guys a picture of this one. So this is known as a lateral curvature of the spine. Okay, so you see how the spine is going to the side instead of being mid-sagittal, going straight down. It's going to have a lateral or to the side curvature. Okay, so a lot of times, if this of course is caught during childhood, early adulthood, usually childhood or teenagers, because you have a better chance of healing better, just because I like to catch it as soon as possible, you may have to have different surgical interventions to correct it. All right, kyphosis is a hunchback. Okay, so an abnormal dorsal curvature. So dorsal, remember that's on the back. And then lordosis, think of someone who is maybe pregnant. They call this sway back. So just how the spine is going to kind of rotate forward or anteriorly to help support that extra weight of the baby. All right, so let's look at some vertebral structures. So this is the kind of the typical vertebral structure. So the anterior portion, anterior and posterior. So some major parts to look out for are the body, and that's that wide kind of flat structure towards the front. Typically on the back, we're going to have a spinous process. So if you want to reach back and feel your spine right now, maybe those little pokey parts you can feel through when you kind of lean over, those are spinous processes. And remember, a process is something that's going to stick out. Okay, so this is the spinous process. You then have transverse processes. So transverse, these are typically going to be on the lateral edges. Like I said, typically each different type of vertebral, so whether it's cervical or thoracic, they have their own types of things that we can go through. All right, so in the middle, we typically have a vertebral foramen, and this is where the spinal cord passes through. So you see how well protected our spinal cord is from all the different things that can actually injure us, all right? So some of the major parts. I'm really not going to ask too many other questions about those, all right? So let's look at the different names of these different types of cervical vertebrae. Remember, cervical is going to be the neck. A lot of people get cervical and cervix mixed up, but cervical is the neck, and then cervix refers to the portion of the end of the vagina before entering into the uterus. So something totally different. All right, remember we said that we have 7 of these. So these are named according to C for cervical and then number 1 through 7. All right, so these are going to be some of the most uniquely shaped vertebrae that we'll see. They're going to have an oval shaped body. All right, they're going to have spinous processes. All right, large vertebral. Let me just show you a picture. There is a landmark, something called the C7. This is the vertebra prominens. So if you want to feel right now on the back of your neck, going down until you feel that little part that kind of sticks out, kind of right before you get to your clavicles anteriorly, that is your vertebra prominens. And it's a landmark so that we know, we kind of count down, okay, we're at C7. And let me show you guys a picture. So these are going to be cervical, the typical cervical right here, a picture of the typical thoracic, and then typical lumbar vertebrae, and we'll go through them. So something specific about cervical vertebrae is that they have a spinous process. That is something called bifid. So it's split into 2. So bifid spinous processes. See that right here, this little split in 2, where the other ones, it just has a single process. Okay, and here they are with a lateral view, and we'll go through those in a second. All right, so C1 through 7. So we have C1, C2, C3. You can kind of see here something different about C1, right? You don't see any kind of spinous process. And the only cervical vertebrae that's typically not going to be bifid is this C7, which is that vertebra prominens. All right, let's talk about the C1 and C2 axes. So the C1 is also known as the atlas, while the C2 is known as the axis, and they each have different unique features. So the atlas, which is C1, it has no body and no spinous process. All right, so this helps, they actually help to carry the skull. These are called occipital condyles. Remember, the occipital part of the brain or the skull is the posterior portion, and condyles are typically little pieces that are going to articulate or help with moving across the bone. The atlas is responsible for nodding the head yes. So you can do that right now. Yes. All right. So that is our C1, our atlas. All right. So you see, this is one of the most unique different vertebrae that you'll see. Okay. All right, let's look at the axis now. This is C2. This has something that no other vertebrae has, and it's a little kind of knob-like feature in the middle called a dens. All right, this helps the head to pivot. So this is shaking your head no. This is the axis that helps us do that. All right, here's our dens with a superior view. And then we have it, let's see, we have your pictures with that superior view. And here's another one, a little piece that kind of pokes up. All right. So let me scroll on down now to our transverse processes down here. We're going to go down to our thoracic portion. So these actually look a little bit different as well. These our spinous processes are they're kind of longer and they point down. All right. And so remember that we have 12 of these thoracic vertebrae and they all articulate with ribs. Here is our lumbar. These are going to be the thickest. So if you're ever confused, you're kind of looking and comparing the different types of vertebrae. These are going to have the thickest bodies and kind of some of the shorter spinous processes. Because they hold the most weight, this is why they're so thick right here in the lumbar vertebrae. They hold most of the weight of the body. All right, so the last portions of our spine, we have the sacrum, which is all of this. It's fused bones. And then we have the coccyx, people also known as our tailbone. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and stop there before we go to the thoracic cage. I know this is a super long video. I'll go ahead and record another one that's going to go over thoracic cage and then also the appendicular skeleton.